The phone rang exactly once a year, and Margaret Eleanor Whitfield had learned to stop expecting it to ring twice. It was December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve, and she sat in the kitchen of the small rented trailer on Route 9, outside Grayson Hollow, West Virginia, with her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had once belonged to her mother. The coffee inside had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't noticed. At 67 years old, Margaret had developed the quiet patience of a woman who had outlived most of the reasons she used to hurry. The trailer smelled of wood smoke from the small iron stove in the corner, and the faint perfume of pine needles from the wreath Eleanor May had made for her back in September when the girl was visiting from Charleston. Eleanor May was her neighbor's granddaughter, 9 years old, with a gap in her front teeth and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. She called Margaret Miss Maggie and brought her drawings twice a week. Eleanor May had more patience for Margaret than Margaret's own children did, and that was a thing Margaret tried not to think about too often, because thinking about it for too long was a door she couldn't afford to open. The kitchen table in front of her held 3 items arranged with the precision of relics on an altar. The first was a yellowed envelope containing the deed to 40 acres of scrubland up on Whitfield Ridge, land her father had left her when he died in 1987. The second was a letter from Mountain Valley Savings and Loan informing her that her property taxes for the year had come due, and that she now owed $472.18 that she did not have. The third was a Christmas card from her daughter Vanessa, postmarked Dallas, Texas, containing a generic picture of a snowman and the words, "Hope you're well, Mom. Busy season at the firm. Love, Vanessa, Brent, and the kids," written in a hand that was not Vanessa's, but which Margaret suspected belonged to Vanessa's assistant. The phone on the wall rang. The sound was so startling that Margaret jumped, and a little of the cold coffee sloshed over the rim of the mug and onto her knuckles. She stood slowly, the arthritis in her right hip protesting the movement, and crossed the small linoleum floor to pick up the receiver. It was an old phone, the kind with a curled cord that always tangled itself into impossible knots. And she had kept it because the cell phone her son Marcus had given her 3 Christmases ago had stopped working 8 months later, and she had not been able to afford to replace it. "Hello, Mom." The voice on the other end was male, brisk, efficient, a voice accustomed to closing deals and ending meetings. Marcus, her oldest, 41 years old now, a commercial real estate attorney in Atlanta, the one she had put herself in debt for twice to help through law school. "Mom, it's Marcus. How are you? Good holiday?" Marcus. She said his name the way a woman might say the name of a man she had loved 20 years ago and was surprised to run into at the grocery store. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you. How are the children? How is Stephanie?" They're fine. Listen, Mom, I don't have a lot of time. I'm calling from the airport. We're flying out to Aspen tonight. But I wanted to check in, make sure you got the card. Did you get the card?" She looked at the table. "I got a card from Vanessa. I haven't gotten one from you yet." Oh, there was a pause, and she could hear the tinny echo of an airport intercom announcing a gate change. "Yeah, Stephanie was supposed to handle that. I'll have her look into it. Listen, Mom, the reason I'm calling, I need you to do me a favor. Actually, it's more like we all need you to do us a favor. Vanessa and Tyler and me. We've been talking." Margaret felt something in her stomach tighten. When her 3 children talked to each other about her, it never meant anything good. "What kind of favor, Marcus?" "Mom, you still have that land up on the ridge, right? The 40 acres Grandpa left you?" "I have it." Okay, good. Here's the thing. Tyler has this buddy, some developer, and this guy is looking for property in the area. Wants to build some kind of retreat or something, doesn't matter. Point is, he's offering $2 an acre. Cash. That's $80 for the whole thing, Mom. And listen, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but that land is worth nothing. It's scrubland. It's not farmable. The road to get up there washes out every spring. You've been paying taxes on it for 38 years for no reason. This is a chance to just be done with it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside the trailer window, snow had begun to fall, small dry flakes that caught on the pine branches and did not melt. "Marcus," she said finally, "why is Tyler's friend offering me $2 an acre for land you just said was worth nothing?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and in that pause Margaret heard a great many things her son did not say. "Mom, come on. Don't make this complicated. The guy's doing you a favor. He wants to consolidate some parcels up there. Your land sits between two tracts he already owns. It's a nuisance buy, that's all. He's rounding out his holdings. Tyler's friend owns land up on the ridge. Since when? I don't know, Mom. A while, I guess. Look, the paperwork is easy. Tyler has the contract. All you have to do is sign it and mail it back. We'll even pay the postage. $80 in your pocket. No more property tax. No more worrying about it. Clean slate. Margaret looked down at the letter from Mountain Valley Savings and Loan. $472.18. She looked at the Christmas card from Vanessa that contained no phone number, no address, no invitation, just a generic snowman. She looked at the envelope with the deed inside. The deed her father, Elias Whitfield, had pressed into her hand 3 days before the cancer took him, when she was 29 years old and had just given birth to Marcus 6 months earlier. You hold on to this land, Margie, her father had said. He had been a coal miner all his life, a man who came home black-faced and coughing, a man who had never owned anything worth more than a used pickup truck and a wedding ring. But when he said those words, there had been something in his eyes that Margaret had never forgotten. Don't you sell it. Not for any reason. Not if they offer you $1,000. Not if they offer you $1 million. You hold it for your babies, and you tell them the same thing when the time comes. Promise me, Margie. She had promised. No, Marcus, Margaret said into the phone. I don't think I'm going to sell. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This silence had weight to it, a density she could feel through the curled cord of the old wall phone. Mom. Marcus. Mom, I don't think you understand. Tyler's friend is being generous here. If you wait, if you try to sell it later, nobody else is going to want that land. You're sitting on a tax liability. Every year it gets worse. What happens when you can't pay the taxes anymore? You think the county just forgets about it? They take it, Mom. They sell it at auction for the back taxes, and you get nothing. Zero. So take the $80 now, while someone's actually willing to write you a check. I don't think I'm going to sell it, Marcus. Mom, listen to me. Is the airport very loud tonight, honey? It sounds loud. You should go catch your plane. Tell Stephanie and the children I said Merry Christmas. Mom, she hung up the phone. Her hand was shaking. She stood with her palm flat against the wall for a moment, steadying herself, and then she walked back to the table and sat down. The cold coffee she had not finished waited for her. She did not drink it. She looked at the deed instead, and she remembered her father's face, and she thought, not for the first time in her life, that promises made to dead men were the heaviest things the living carried. The phone rang again. She knew, even before she picked it up, which of her children it would be. Hello? Mom, it's Tyler. Marcus just called me. He said you were being difficult. Tyler was her youngest, 34 years old. Something in tech, something in San Francisco, something that paid him an obscene amount of money and had, over the past 10 years, steadily erased every trace of West Virginia from his voice. He had taken his wife's last name when they married. She remembered. Fulton. Tyler Fulton. He was a stranger now, a man she had carried inside her body and nursed and raised through colic and fever and schoolyard fights. And he had become a stranger so gradually that she had never been able to point to the moment it happened. Hello, Tyler. How are you? Mom, I need you to work with me here. Marcus explained the situation. My buddy Derek is trying to put together a land package, and your parcel is in the middle of it. He's not going to wait around forever. If you want to screw this up for all of us, fine, but at least tell me why. Why would it screw things up for you, Tyler? Because, Mom, because Derek is a friend. Because I told him we could deliver. Because now I'm going to look like an idiot if my own mother can't handle signing a piece of paper. You told Derek I would sell before you asked me. It's a formality, Mom. Nobody turns down free money. It's not free money, Tyler. It's my father's land. Grandpa's been dead for almost 40 years, Mom. He's not going to know. Margaret closed her eyes. She could see her father's face very clearly in that moment. The creases at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, the gray stubble on his jaw, the hand he had placed on her shoulder the day he gave her the deed. He had weighed less than 130 pounds by the end. She had held his hand while he died in a rented hospital bed in her mother's kitchen, and she had promised him about the land, and she had never broken that promise in 38 years. Tyler, she said, I'd like to ask you a question, and I'd like you to think about it before you answer. What? How many times have you called me this year? There was a silence. In the silence, she heard him shift the phone from one ear to the other. Mom, don't do this. I'm not doing anything. I'm asking a question. How many times have you called me this year, Tyler? I've been really busy, Mom. Work has been insane. Jessica and I are trying to. It's twice. You called me on my birthday in April, and you're calling me now. Marcus calls me once a year, the week before Christmas. Vanessa sends a card. That's it. That's the entire contact I have with my 3 children over 12 months of my life. She paused. Her voice was very steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. And now you're calling because there is something you want from me. Do you see how that looks from where I'm sitting, Tyler? Mom, that's not fair. Maybe not, but it's true. So here is what I am going to tell you, and I would like you to tell your brother and your sister as well, so that none of us has to have this conversation again. I am not selling the land. Not for $2 an acre. Not for 200. Not for 2,000. Your grandfather asked me not to, and I gave him my word, and my word is the only thing I have left that belongs entirely to me. Do you understand? Mom, do you understand, Tyler? She heard him breathing. She heard the hum of some expensive appliance in the background of his life, a refrigerator or a wine cooler or something she could not identify. She heard the distance between them, which had nothing to do with miles. This is stupid, Mom. This is so stupid. You're choosing a dead man's pride over your own children. No, honey, she said, and her voice had gone soft now, not weak, but soft the way old leather is soft. No, I'm choosing a dead man who meant his promises over living children who only remember I exist when they want something. That's a different thing entirely. She hung up the phone for the second time in 10 minutes. This time her hand did not shake. This time she walked to the sink and poured the cold coffee down the drain, and she rinsed the mug, and she set it in the dish rack to dry. Outside, the snow had begun to fall harder, thick clumps now instead of dry flakes, and the wind was picking up from the west. She thought about how the road up to the ridge would be impassable by morning. She thought about her father. She thought about the 40 acres her son had called worth nothing. The phone rang a third time. She did not answer it. She knew it was Vanessa, and she knew what Vanessa would say, and she was not ready to hear her only daughter tell her, with the polished diction of a woman who had worked very hard to escape the accent of her childhood, that she was being selfish and difficult, and that she was going to die alone if she did not learn to think about other people for a change. Margaret put on her coat. It was an old wool coat, olive green, with a tear in the lining that she kept meaning to mend. She pulled on her boots. She wrapped a scarf around her neck. She took the deed from the table and folded it carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of the coat, and then she stepped out into the snow. The cold bit at her face immediately. The trailer sat on a small lot at the end of a gravel drive, and beyond the drive the woods began, and beyond the woods the land rose up toward Whitfield Ridge, which she could not see through the falling snow, but which she knew was there, the way she knew her own heartbeat was there. She had walked that ridge 1,000 times when she was a girl. Her father had taught her the names of the trees and the places where the deer bedded down and the spot where the spring came up out of the rock even in the driest August. She had not been up there in nearly 2 years. Her hip made the climb difficult now, and she had not had a reason. She stood at the edge of her gravel drive, and she looked west into the storm, and she thought, I ought to go see it. Not tonight, not in this weather, but soon. I ought to go see what I've been protecting. A voice came from behind her. Miss Maggie, are you all right? She turned. Eleanor May was standing at the edge of the drive in a pink puffer coat 2 sizes too big, her grandmother's old coat cut down to fit a 9-year-old. Her breath made small clouds in the air. She had a lunchbox in one mittened hand and a library book in the other. Margaret remembered that Eleanor May's grandmother had been sick, that the child had been staying with her and walking home from the bus stop alone. I'm all right, honey. Just getting some air. It's cold, Miss Maggie. You should come inside. I know, sweetheart. I will. Did you have a good day at school? Eleanor May nodded solemnly. We had a Christmas concert. I sang a solo. Did you? What did you sing? In the bleak midwinter. Mrs. Paget said I had a real voice. Margaret felt something catch in her throat. She did not know why. Maybe it was the phrase, bleak midwinter, or maybe it was the small pink figure of the child standing in the snow, or maybe it was everything. She held out her hand. Eleanor May crossed the drive and took it. You want to come have some hot chocolate with me, honey? I have the real kind, not the packets. Yes, please. They walked back to the trailer together. Margaret did not look at the phone when they came inside. She did not check to see if the light on the answering machine was blinking, though she was certain Vanessa had left a message. She heated milk on the stove and melted chocolate into it, and added a little cinnamon the way her own grandmother had taught her to do 60 years ago. She poured it into 2 mugs and gave the unchipped one to Eleanor May, and they sat at the kitchen table together while the snow fell harder outside. "Miss Maggie," the child said after a while. "Yes, honey. Are you sad?" Margaret looked at her. The girl had her mother's dark eyes, serious and direct. "A little, sweetheart, but not about anything that matters." "Okay," said Eleanor May. And then, because she was 9, she began to talk about the school concert and the boy who had stepped on her foot during Jingle Bells and her grandmother's cough medicine, which tasted like licorice. And Margaret listened, and the trailer filled up with the sound of a child's voice, and outside the snow kept falling, and 40 miles away, in a hotel bar in Dallas, Texas, a man named Derek Halvorson was ordering a second scotch and wondering why he had not yet received confirmation on the Whitfield parcel, which he needed in order to close a $140 million deal by the end of the first quarter. But Margaret did not know any of that yet. Nobody did. The snow fell for 3 days. By the time it stopped, 26 inches had accumulated on the ground, and the roads in and out of Grayson Hollow were closed to everything except emergency vehicles. Margaret kept the wood stove going around the clock, bundled herself in 2 sweaters and her father's old flannel, and read through the stack of library books she had brought home the week before. She did not answer the phone, which rang 4 more times between Christmas Eve and the morning of the 26th. The light on the answering machine blinked steadily. She did not listen to the messages. On the morning of the 27th, she was digging her car out of the drive when a pickup truck turned in from the main road. She straightened, shading her eyes against the hard winter sun, and she recognized the truck before she recognized the man driving it. The truck was a 1998 Ford F-150, dark blue, with a dent in the passenger door that had been there as long as Margaret had known the vehicle. The man driving was Wendell Hayes. Wendell was 71 years old, a widower, a retired forestry officer for the state of West Virginia. He had been her father's closest friend in the last decade of Elias Whitfield's life. He had carried her father's casket at the funeral, and he had shown up at her trailer twice a month for the past 38 years to check on her, to bring her a sack of apples from his orchard, to fix whatever needed fixing and refuse payment for it, and to sit at her kitchen table drinking coffee and saying very little. He was a man built like his truck, old, weathered, dented, still running. He had a full head of white hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved out of the same sandstone that made up the ridge. He parked the truck and climbed out slowly, favoring his left knee, and walked over to where she was standing with the snow shovel. He was carrying a thermos and a paper bag. "Margie, Wendell, brought you some biscuits. My niece made too many. And coffee, the real kind, not that instant stuff you drink." "I don't drink instant." "Sure you do. Your grandmother drank instant. You learned it from her." She took the thermos and the bag, and she almost smiled, which was something she had not done in several days. "Come on in. I'll get another cup." They sat at the kitchen table. Wendell ate a biscuit. Margaret sipped his coffee, which was, as always, better than hers. For a long time, neither of them said anything. This was how it went with Wendell. He was the only person in her life with whom silence was not a problem that needed solving. Finally, he said, "Your boy Tyler called me yesterday." Margaret set her mug down. "Did he?" "Yep. Didn't know he had my number. Must have gotten it off you sometime." Wendell brushed a crumb from the front of his coat. "Wanted to know if I'd talked to you about selling the ridge parcel. Said you were being unreasonable." Said his brother and sister agreed. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I don't involve myself in family matters." "That was kind of you, Wendell." Then I told him his grandfather would have taken a belt to him for even asking. Margaret did laugh then, a small quiet laugh, more exhale than sound. "Oh, Wendell, I'm not saying I was polite about it. I'm just saying I was honest." She poured herself a second cup of his coffee. Outside, a crow was walking along the top of the fence, looking in through the kitchen window, its eye cocked at the biscuits on the table. "Wendell," she said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "When my father gave me that land, when he made me promise not to sell it, did he ever tell you why?" Wendell took a long time answering. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the crow. He looked at Margaret, and she thought for a moment that he was going to say something he had been holding on to for a long time, and she felt her chest grow tight with the sudden fear of it. He said the land was the one thing he ever gave you that was worth anything. That's not an answer, Wendell. It's the one I've got. She looked at him. He looked back. There was something in his eyes, something careful, and she had known this man long enough to recognize when he was walking around a thing rather than through it. Wendell, did my father tell you something about that land? Something you haven't told me? Margie, just tell me. He sighed. He ran a hand through his white hair. He seemed, in that moment, much older than he had when he walked in. Your father was a proud man, Margie. You know that. He didn't like to owe anybody anything, and he didn't like charity, and he didn't like to admit when he was wrong. But he was a man who thought about things. Thought about them for a long time before he said them. And in the last year of his life, he started talking about that land. Not all the time. Just now and then. He said things like he said, Wendell, I walked up on the North Ridge the other day, and I saw something. Or he'd say, Wendell, there's things on that land I never told Margie about. And I'd ask him, what things, Elias? And he'd shake his head and say, I'll tell her when the time comes. I'll write it down. But then the cancer came on fast. Faster than any of us expected. And I don't know if he ever wrote it down, Margie. I don't know if he got the chance. Margaret stared at him. What do you mean, things on that land? I don't know. He wouldn't say. Could have been anything. Could have been nothing. Your father was a mountain man and a coal miner, and he saw things in the ground most of us wouldn't know how to look for. But I'll tell you this, Margie, and you can do with it what you want. When he was dying, and you came to sit with him that last week, and he gave you the deed, I was there, you remember. I was in the next room, and I heard what he said to you. I heard him make you promise. I remember. The thing he said before that. You might not have caught it, because you were crying and he was whispering by then. But what he said was, Margie, there is more on that land than I ever told you. When you're ready, you go look. You go look for where the water comes out of the rock. Margaret did not move. The crow on the fence outside flapped once and flew off, and the sound of its wings was very loud in the stillness of the kitchen. Where the water comes out of the rock, she repeated. That's what he said. And you never told me this before. I never told you because he died the next morning, and you were half out of your mind with grief, and by the time you might have been able to hear it, it didn't seem like it would do anything but hurt you. I figured if he meant for you to find it, you'd find it. He'd made you promise not to sell. That seemed like enough. She sat back in her chair. The wood stove ticked. The morning sun coming in through the kitchen window was the hard, clear kind that only follows a big snow, and it made the Formica tabletop shine like a piece of polished bone. Wendell, she said, where the water comes out of the rock. That's the spring. The one at the base of the north face. My father took me up there when I was 11. I figured as much. There's a cave. A little shallow one. Goes back maybe 15 feet. He said it was where he went as a boy when he wanted to think. I never knew about a cave. It's not much, but it's there. She was quiet for a long time. Wendell refilled his own coffee. He did not press her. He did not push. He sat and he waited, because he was the only person in her life besides a dead man and a 9-year-old girl who had ever understood how to wait for Margaret Whitfield without making her feel that the waiting was a burden. The snow's too deep to get up there, she said finally. It is. But it'll settle in a week or two. It will. Wendell, would you go up there with me? When the snow settles. He looked at her. His eyes were very blue, and the lines around them were deep. Margie, you don't even have to ask. She nodded. She looked down at her hands, which were old, she realized, old and spotted and lined with the work of a life spent cleaning other people's houses and raising 3 children who no longer spoke to her. She thought about her father. She thought about the spring. She thought about the things in the ground that a mountain man and a coal miner knew how to see that other people did not. And for the first time in a long time, she thought about the possibility that her father, who had loved her more than anyone in the world had ever loved her, might have left her something more than a promise. The phone, of course, began to ring again that afternoon. Vanessa, this time. Margaret let the machine get it. Mom, it's me. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. Marcus said you hung up on him, and Tyler said you were being completely unreasonable. And Mom, I have to say I'm extremely disappointed in the way you're handling this. Derek is a very important client of Tyler's firm, and this is not the kind of thing you do to family. I don't understand why you're making this so difficult. Call me back, Mom. We need to talk. The machine clicked off. Margaret looked at it. She did not feel angry, which surprised her. She felt something closer to sorrow, a kind of quiet grief that felt like standing at the edge of a grave she had been digging for a long time without realizing it. Her daughter's voice on that machine, that brisk, clipped, impatient voice that was not the voice of the little girl Margaret had rocked to sleep in a rocking chair her father had built by hand. That was not the voice of the teenager Margaret had sewn a prom dress for at 3 in the morning because they could not afford to buy one. That was not the voice of the young woman Margaret had driven to college in a borrowed car with $200 in the glove compartment, money Margaret had saved for 6 months by skipping lunch. That was the voice of a stranger who happened to share her blood. "Disappointed in me," Margaret said quietly to the kitchen. "Disappointed in me." She went to the cupboard. She took out the old tin canister where she kept her letters. She sat at the table and she began to go through them. The letters she had kept over the years, cards and birthday notes, and the handful of real letters from back when people still wrote real letters. She did not know what she was looking for. She found Vanessa's acceptance letter to the University of Virginia, dated 2002. She found Marcus's first letter home from law school, which had been 2 paragraphs long and had asked for money. She found a crayon drawing Tyler had made when he was 6, a picture of the family standing in front of the trailer, all 5 of them, including her husband Charlie, who had died in a car accident on Route 19 when Tyler was 8 and had, by his absence, changed the shape of all their lives in ways Margaret had never entirely understood. At the bottom of the tin, she found something she had forgotten. It was a letter, a real letter, handwritten, on lined yellow paper that had gone soft and foxed with age. The handwriting was her father's, the careful looping hand of a man who had left school in the 6th grade and had taught himself to write beautifully because he was ashamed of his lack of education. She stared at it for a long moment. She did not remember putting it in this tin. She did not remember reading it before. The envelope was addressed in her father's hand, and it said only, "For Margie, when you need it." She sat very still. Outside, the sun had shifted, and the kitchen was growing dim. Somewhere down the road, a snowplow was grinding along Route 9, and beyond that there was the vast white silence of the mountains. Margaret picked up the letter. Her hands were trembling now, the way they had not trembled when Marcus called, or when Tyler called, or when Vanessa's voice had filled the kitchen with its disappointment. She turned the envelope over. It had not been opened. The flap was still sealed with the dried glue of the better part of 4 decades. She did not know when her father had written it. She did not know when he had slipped it into the tin with her other letters, or how it had ended up there. She did not know if Wendell knew about it. She did not know, she realized, anything about her father at all except that he had loved her, and that he had told her to hold on to the land, and that he had known something about that land which he had not, in his living days, been able to tell her. She slid her finger under the flap. The old glue gave way easily. She pulled the letter out and unfolded it on the kitchen table, and she smoothed it flat with her palm, and in the last of the winter afternoon light, she began to read. "My dear Margie, if you are reading this letter, it is because you have need of it, and you have found it, and the good Lord has seen fit to bring you to this table at this moment of your life. I am writing it now because the doctor told me today that what I have is the kind of sickness that does not go away, and I have a matter of months maybe, and I want to say some things to you while I still can say them clearly. I am going to hide this letter in the tin where you keep the children's cards. You check that tin every few years, I know you do. If you find it before the hard time comes, good, you can read it and throw it away and call me a foolish old man for writing it. If you find it in the hard time, I hope it helps you. Margie, I want to tell you about the land." Her breath caught. She gripped the edge of the table with her free hand. She kept reading. "Your grandfather bought the 40 acres on the ridge in 1919 for $15 an acre. He bought it from a man named Amos Crowder who was losing his farm to the bank and needed cash fast. Your grandfather did not have the money, but he took out a loan against his back wages at the mine, and he made the down payment, and he paid it off over 11 years. He was a proud man. He did not tell anyone. Not even his wife, your grandmother, knew the whole story until after he died. The reason he bought that land, Margie, is because he knew something about it that nobody else knew. When he was a young man, he worked 2 summers as a helper to a surveyor out of Charleston. The surveyor was a man named Leland Hoff, a geologist, sent out by one of the mining companies to walk the ridges and look for things. Your grandfather learned from him. He learned how to read the rock. He learned the things a man can see if he knows how to look. Margie, there is coal under that land. I know you knew that already. It's West Virginia. There is coal under most of it, but the coal is not the thing. The thing is what is above the coal, in the seam that runs along the north face where the spring comes out of the rock. Your grandfather believed, and I believe, and before he died, I had a man from the university come up there and confirm it quiet as I could, that what is in that seam is not coal. It is something else. Your grandfather did not know the word for it in his day. They called it Blackwater stone. The university man called it something longer. I cannot remember the word. I have it written down in my study in the cedar box under the window. You will find the papers there when you go looking. The man from the university told me that what is in that seam is worth, if it is as large as he believes it to be, more money than he was comfortable saying out loud. He said to me, Mr. Whitfield, if this holds at depth, your family has been sitting on a fortune for 80 years. He said, you should not tell anyone, Mr. Whitfield, because men will come, and they will try to take it from you. So I did not tell anyone, Margie. I did not even tell you, because you were young, and you had a baby, and I did not want you to carry the weight of it before you were ready. I meant to tell you in time. But the cancer is moving faster than the doctors thought it would, and I am writing this now, tonight, because I do not know how many tonights I have left. Margie, if you are reading this letter, I want you to do 3 things. First, I want you to not sell the land. No matter what anyone offers. No matter who asks. No matter how hard the times get. You hear me, girl? You do not sell. Second, I want you to go up to the cedar box in my study, which will be in Wendell Hayes's safekeeping after I am gone, because I trust Wendell more than I trust any other man alive. You open that box, and you find the papers from the university man. His name was Dr. Harlan Burke. He may be gone by the time you read this, but his papers will tell you what is there, and what it is worth, and how to prove it. Third, and this is the hardest thing, Margie, I want you to remember that what is in the ground does not matter as much as what you do with it. A rich woman can be as lonely as a poor one. A rich woman can lose her children just the same. You use what is yours, but you use it in the way your mother would have used it. You help the ones who help you. You honor the ones who kept their word. You do not let the money make you into somebody your daddy would not recognize. I love you more than I ever told you, Margie. I love you more than the land, more than the life I lived, more than anything I ever had to give. I am sorry I was not a man who knew how to say it better when I was living. I hope you can feel it now, in this letter, the way you used to feel it when I carried you up on my shoulders to see the stars. Your daddy, Elias. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in the dim kitchen with the letter in her hands, and she did not move for a very long time. The sun finished its descent behind the ridge. The trailer grew cold. The wood stove needed another log, and she did not get up to add one. Somewhere outside a dog barked, and somewhere further away a truck ground through the snow, and the world went on with itself as if nothing in it had changed. But something had changed. She set the letter down gently. She picked up the phone. She dialed a number from memory, a number she knew as well as her own. Hayes residence. Wendell. Margie? Everything all right? Wendell, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. All right. Did my father ever leave anything with you? A box? Papers? There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not a surprised silence. A considered one. Margie, Wendell said slowly. You sitting down? I am. Your father gave me a cedar box the week before he died. He told me to keep it. He said if you ever asked about it, I was to give it to you. If you never asked, I was to keep it until I died, and then my niece was to pass it along to you. And if you were gone too, she was to burn it. Wendell, I've had it in my hall closet for 38 years, Margie. I haven't opened it. I never opened it. That wasn't my business. Margaret closed her eyes. Wendell, can you bring it over here? It's getting dark, Margie. Roads are bad. I can bring it in the morning. Bring it in the morning. First thing. I will. She was about to hang up. Then she said, Wendell. Yeah. Thank you. For keeping it. For all these years. Margie, he said, and his voice was rough in a way it rarely was. Your father was the finest man I ever knew. Keeping a box in a closet for 38 years is the least a man could do for Elias Whitfield. Don't thank me. I haven't earned thanks. She hung up the phone. She stood in the darkening kitchen. Her legs were unsteady. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow, which was blue now in the last of the light, and at the woods beyond the snow, and at the ridge she could not see but which she knew was there. 40 acres. Land she had paid taxes on for 38 years while her own children told her it was worth nothing. Land a man named Derek Halvorson was trying to buy from her for $80. Land her grandfather had bought with a loan against back wages at the mine, because a surveyor from Charleston had taught him how to read the rock. Blackwater stone. She did not know the word, but she knew the shape of what was coming. She had watched enough coal trucks roll down out of those mountains in her childhood to know what it meant when men started wanting land they had previously ignored. She knew what it meant when the calls started coming, and the offers went up, and the sudden interest arrived out of nowhere. She knew, with the deep knowing of a woman who had grown up in the hollows and had never left them, that something had happened recently. Something had shifted. Some piece of knowledge had leaked out into the world that had made her 40 acres, which the county taxed as scrubland at a rate of $11 an acre, worth something else entirely. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time. And then, quietly, she began to laugh. It was not a happy laugh, and it was not a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who has spent her whole life being told she was a fool, and who has just discovered that the thing she was being a fool about was the only thing she had ever been right about. Outside, the wind picked up, and the snow began to fall again in small hard flakes. Inside, Margaret Whitfield lit the lamp on the kitchen table, and she folded her father's letter carefully, and she put it in the inside pocket of her coat beside the deed, and she sat down to wait for morning. She did not sleep that night. She tried. She lay down on the narrow bed in the back room of the trailer at around 10 o'clock, under the quilt her mother had stitched for her wedding 61 years ago, and she closed her eyes, and she counted her breathing the way a nurse had once taught her to do when Charlie first died, and sleep had left her for the better part of 2 years. But the counting did not work. Every time she felt herself beginning to drift, her mind came back to the letter, and to the cedar box that had been sitting in Wendell Hayes's hall closet for 38 years, and to the words Blackwater stone, which meant nothing to her, and yet which seemed, somehow, to mean everything. Around 2 in the morning she got up. She made herself a cup of tea chamomile, because she was trying to sleep, though by then she had mostly given up on the idea, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she wrote out a list on the back of a grocery store receipt. She had always been a list maker. Charlie used to tease her about it. He said she would write a list of lists if you gave her a long enough afternoon. Her list had 6 items on it. Do not tell the children anything until you know what you have. Do not tell anyone else either, not even Eleanor May's grandmother, not the woman at the post office. When Wendell comes in the morning, read the papers in the box with him present. Find out if Dr. Harlan Burke is still alive, and if he is not, find out if he left students, or if he wrote anything down in a public place. Walk the ridge as soon as the snow permits. Take Wendell, do not go alone. And last, remember what your father said, the money is not the thing is what you do with it. She underlined the 6th item twice. Then she folded the receipt and tucked it into the pocket of her housecoat, and she finished her tea, and she sat in the kitchen chair with her chin on her hand until the sky outside the kitchen window began to turn the pale gray of a winter dawn. At 6:30, exactly, she heard Wendell's truck coming down the gravel drive. He had said first thing in the morning, and Wendell had always been a man who meant what he said. She stood up. She smoothed her housecoat. She went to the door. He was standing on the small wooden porch with a cedar box under his arm. It was not a large box, maybe the size of a shoebox, maybe a little bigger. It was the color of old honey, and the grain in the wood was visible even through the thin layer of dust that had settled on it over the decades. There was a small brass latch on the front. It was not locked. Margie. Come in, Wendell. He came in. He stood in the kitchen in his heavy coat, holding the box, and he looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Respect, maybe, or apprehension, or the kind of attention a man pays to something he has been carrying on his shoulders for a long time without realizing how heavy it was. You sure you want to do this with me here? I'm sure. It's your business, Margie. I can step out. No, Wendell. You've been part of this since before I knew there was a this. You stay. He nodded. He set the box on the kitchen table beside her father's letter and her grandmother's chipped mug and the grocery store receipt with her list on it. Margaret looked at the box for a long moment. Then she reached out, and she undid the brass latch, and she lifted the lid. Inside the box there were papers. A lot of papers. They had been arranged carefully, each stack tied with a piece of twine. On top of the papers there was a smaller envelope, sealed, and on the front of the envelope, in her father's handwriting, were the words, for Margie. Read this first. She looked at Wendell. Wendell looked at her. Neither of them spoke. She opened the envelope. The paper inside was a single sheet, folded in thirds. Her father had written on both sides in his careful looping hand. The ink had faded in the decades since he had set it down, but it was still legible. She read it aloud, because it felt wrong to read it silently with Wendell sitting there, and because her voice, though unsteady at first, steadied as she went on. Margie, by the time you read this, you have already read the letter in the tin, and you have come to Wendell, and so you already know most of what I am going to say. This is just the part one could not say there. What is in this box is everything I could gather about the land before I got too sick to gather any more. There is a map your grandfather drew, showing where the seam comes up to the surface. There is a letter from Dr. Harlan Burke at West Virginia University describing what he saw when I took him up there in the summer of 1986. There is a little sample of the rock itself, wrapped in cloth, which he left with me. There is a list of names, men I knew, men in the county who might come looking for that land if word ever got out. I do not know if any of them are still living. I do not know if the word ever will get out. But if it does, Margie, they will come. They will be polite at first. They will offer you more money than you have ever seen. They will smile, and they will bring their lawyers, and they will try to make you feel like you are being foolish for holding on. You remember, Margie. You remember that I told you. You hold on anyway. The land is yours. It was your grandfather's before it was mine, and it was mine before it was yours, and it will be your children's after you if they prove themselves worthy of it. That last part is the part one have been thinking about the most these past weeks. You have 3 good babies, Margie. Marcus and Vanessa and Tyler. I love them. I will miss watching them grow up. But I want to tell you something, and I want you to promise you will remember it. Not every child becomes the kind of grown person who deserves their inheritance. Some of them do, and some of them do not. And it is not your job or mine or anybody's to force the ones who do not. You watch them, Margie. You watch how they treat you when you have nothing to give them. That is how you will know. Your father, Elias. Margaret set the letter down. She realized her hand was shaking. Wendell reached across the table and rested his old weathered hand on top of hers, and he did not say anything, and she was glad for that, because if he had said anything in that moment, she would have begun to cry, and she was not yet ready to cry. She sat for a long time with her hand under his. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window the sun was coming up properly now, turning the snow pink at the edges, and somewhere in the woods a crow was calling. Wendell, she said at last. I'm here, Margie. I'm going to need help. You got it. I don't know what any of this means yet. I don't know what we have. But I know that if my children find out before I'm ready, they will not behave the way my father would have wanted them to behave. And I know there are men out there already, right now, who know more about my land than I do. And I know I am 67 years old, and my hip hurts, and I cannot do this alone. Margie, Wendell said, you listen to me. Your daddy was the finest man I ever knew, and your mama was the finest woman. And you are the best of both of them. And I should have told you that a long time ago, and I am sorry I did not. You are not alone. You have not been alone since the day Elias Whitfield shook my hand in 1961 and told me he had a daughter he was proud of. Whatever is in that box, and whatever is up on that ridge, we will figure it out. Together. She nodded. She did not trust her voice. Outside, the phone on the wall began to ring again. They both looked at it. It rang 4 times, and then the answering machine picked up, and Vanessa's voice, brisk and exasperated, came into the room for the second time in 2 days. Mom, it's Vanessa. Tyler says you still haven't signed the paperwork. I don't know what game you're playing, but Derek needs an answer by the end of the week. Marcus is flying back on Sunday, and he says he's going to come out there if he has to. Mom, please, just sign the papers. Stop making this so difficult. The machine clicked off. Margaret and Wendell looked at each other across the kitchen table. End of the week, Wendell said. End of the week, Margaret repeated. She turned the map in the cedar box so that the north face of the ridge faced her. The paper was brittle. Her grandfather's handwriting was on it. In pencil, faded but legible. There was a small X marked at the place where the spring came out of the rock, and beside the X her grandfather had written, in letters so small she had to lean in to read them, the words, "Here begins everything." Margaret Whitfield smiled for the first time in many days. Wendell, she said, I believe it is time we went and had a look at our land. They did not go up the ridge that morning. The snow was still too deep, and Wendell, who knew the mountain the way Margaret knew the lines on her own hand, said it would be another 4 days at least before the trail was passable even with snowshoes. In the meantime, he said, they had work to do. Paperwork, phone calls, a trip to the county courthouse in Grayson Hollow to look at property records. And above all, they had to be careful, because Derek Halvorson had not bought up 2 tracts of land on either side of hers by being a man who left things to chance. They spent the first day going through the cedar box. Margaret made a second pot of coffee, and they laid the papers out on the kitchen table in the order her father had arranged them, and they worked through them one by one. The first stack was her grandfather's. Hand-drawn maps on butcher paper, yellowed at the edges. Notes in pencil that had faded until Margaret had to tilt them toward the window to read. A list of rock samples her grandfather had collected over the course of his life, each one numbered and described in the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who had taught himself everything he knew about geology by reading library books on his lunch breaks at the mine. The second stack was the letter from Dr. Harlan Burke. It was typed on university letterhead, dated August 19, 1986, and it ran to 4 single-spaced pages. Margaret read the whole thing aloud, slowly, while Wendell sat and listened with his hands folded on the table in front of him. Most of it was technical. Burke described the north face of the ridge in detail, the angle of the seam, the way it broke through the surface at the place where the spring emerged, the color of the rock and its density, and the way it responded to acid and to flame. Margaret did not understand a great deal of what she was reading, but she understood the last paragraph of the letter, which was not technical at all. Mr. Whitfield, Dr. Burke had written, I will be plain with you, as you have asked me to be. What you have shown me is the surface expression of what I believe is a substantial deposit of high-grade anthracite transition material with the mineral inclusions I described above. If my readings are correct, and if the deposit extends to the depth the surface indicators suggest, then you are sitting on a geological feature that is, to my knowledge, unique in this part of the state. I cannot give you a dollar figure. I am not a commercial assessor, and I would mislead you if I tried. What I can tell you is this. If a mining concern were to learn of this deposit and wish to acquire the surface rights in order to extract it, the figure they would be willing to pay would be in the multiple millions, possibly tens of millions. I say this not to excite you, but to warn you. You have been wise, I think, to keep this to yourself. If you wish to pass the land on to your heirs, I would suggest you continue to do so. Sincerely, Harlan J. Burke, Ph.D., Department of Geology, West Virginia University. Margaret set the letter down. Wendell did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, that was 1986. Yes. Prices have probably gone up since then. Yes. Margie. I know, Wendell. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a snowplow was going past on Route 9, and the sound of its blades scraping the road was very loud in the stillness of the morning. Margaret looked at her hands. They were old hands. They had cleaned a great many houses in her life. They had raised 3 children. They had buried a husband and a father and a mother and a baby sister who had lived for only 9 days in the summer of 1962. They had never, in all those years, held anything that anyone might call a fortune. Tens of millions, she said quietly. That's what the man wrote. Tens of millions, Wendell. I heard you the first time. My children offered me $80. Wendell did not answer that. He did not need to. The numbers spoke for themselves, and the distance between them was so vast that any comment would only have diminished it. The third stack in the cedar box was the list her father had mentioned. Names, 27 of them, written out in his hand, with small notes beside each. Some were crossed out with a single horizontal line, and beside those her father had written the word dead and a year. Others were not crossed out. Margaret read the names. She recognized a few. There was a man named Earl Cantrell who had owned the hardware store in Grayson Hollow when she was a girl. There was a man named Buford Matney, whose family had been in coal since before the Civil War. There was a Dr. Harold Sizemore, who had been a county commissioner in the 90s. And at the bottom of the list, written in darker ink, as if added later, there was a name Margaret did not recognize. Halvorson, Axel. Followed by, Montana, Sons in the Business. Margaret pointed at it. Wendell. I see it. Halvorson. I see it, Margie. She looked up at him. My son's friend. Derek. Tyler said his name was Derek Halvorson. I know what Tyler said. That's not coincidence. No, it is not. She leaned back in her chair. She felt, for a moment, the particular cold that a person feels when they realize that something they have taken for accidental has been planned for a long time. Not by her, of course. She was the one it had been planned around. But by somebody, out in the world, a man she had never met, whose father, perhaps, had been on her father's list. Axel Halvorsen from Montana, with sons in the business. One of those sons was now, according to Marcus, a developer who had bought up 2 tracts of land on either side of hers and was offering her $80 to round out his holdings. Wendell, how does Tyler even know this man? I don't know, Margie. That's something we should find out. How do we find that out? Wendell thought for a moment. He had a way of thinking that Margaret had always admired. He did not rush. He did not fill the silence with talk the way most men did. He just sat, and he thought. And when he had thought enough, he said what he had come to think. I've got a niece, he said. Alma's girl. The one who's a librarian up in Morgantown. She knows how to find things on the computer. I've never been much good with that stuff. But she's good with it. If there's a trail between Tyler and the Halvorsens, she can find it. Can we trust her? Margie, she's blood. And she's a librarian. I don't know anybody more honest than a librarian. Margaret almost smiled. All right, call your niece. The 4th item in the cedar box was not a stack of papers. It was a small wrapped object, about the size of a chicken's egg, bound in cloth that had once been white and had yellowed to the color of weak tea. Margaret unwrapped it carefully. Inside the cloth was a piece of rock. It was dark, almost black, but there were threads of something else running through it, faint silvery lines that caught the light when she turned the rock in her palm. It was heavier than she had expected. She held it for a moment. Her grandfather had pried this stone out of the ground 80 years before she was born. Her father had carried it to a geologist at the state university and held it in his hand the way she was holding it now. She turned it over. There were small white flecks embedded in the dark surface that looked, in a certain light, almost like stars. Wendell. Yeah. I want you to take this and put it back in the box and put the box somewhere safe. Not here. Somewhere in your house where nobody would look for it. I can do that. I want to keep one thing from this box. Just one. She reached for the stack of her grandfather's maps. She took the smallest one, the one that showed only the north face of the ridge, the one with the X marked here begins everything. She folded it carefully. This goes in my dresser. In the drawer with Charlie's shirts. Nobody goes in that drawer but me. All right. The rest I want you to keep. Margie, this is your family's business. Not mine. Wendell. She looked at him. My family includes you. Has for longer than I've been alive. Put the box in your house. If anything happens to me, you know what to do with it. And if nothing happens to me, I'll come get it back when the dust settles. He did not argue. He never argued when she used that tone. He just nodded, and he folded the cloth around the rock, and he put the rock back in the box with the papers, and he closed the lid, and he latched the brass latch, and he set his hand on the top of the cedar box for a moment, as though he were making a promise to somebody who was not there to hear it. I'll keep it safe, he said. I know you will. The phone rang at 11:17 that morning. Margaret let the machine take it. It was not one of her children, this time. It was a man's voice she did not recognize, polished and pleasant. The voice of somebody who had learned early in life that pleasantness was the most efficient tool in a salesman's kit. Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Derek Halvorsen. I believe your son Tyler may have mentioned me. I'm calling from Dallas. I understand there's been some confusion about my offer on your property, and I wanted to reach out personally and see if we could clear it up. I think once we have a chance to talk, you'll see that what I'm proposing is a very fair deal for everyone involved. I'm going to give you my personal cell number, and I'd be grateful if you could give me a call back at your convenience. Again, this is Derek. The number is. Margaret walked over to the machine and turned the volume down so she would not have to hear the rest of it. She stood in front of the machine for a moment with her hand still on the dial. Then she walked back to the kitchen table and sat down across from Wendell. He's calling me directly now. He is. He knows my name. He knows I'm an old woman living alone. And his voice was the voice of a man who has done this before. Probably has. Wendell. She looked at him. I'm going to need to be smart about this. I don't know how to be smart about men like him. I've spent my whole life not needing to be. Wendell leaned forward across the table. He did not take her hand. He did not touch her, but his eyes were very clear and very steady. And when he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who had spent 40 years of his life standing up in courtrooms and hearing rooms, explaining why loggers could not cut this stand and why strip miners could not dig that slope, and who had, over the course of those years, developed a deep practical knowledge of how wealthy men behaved when they wanted something that did not belong to them. Margie, he said, you listen to me. You don't have to be smart the way Derek Halvorson is smart. That kind of smart is a trick of the trade. It is learned, and it can be beat. What you have to be is honest, and you have to be patient, and you have to be willing to say no for as long as it takes. A man like Halvorson, he is used to people saying yes eventually. He is not used to no being the final answer. If you can hold the line on no, Margie, he will eventually run out of tools. I have seen it happen. Not often, but I have seen it. How do you hold the line, Wendell? You get a lawyer. A real one. Not somebody's cousin and not the fellow down at the strip mall who does wills and DUIs. You get a lawyer who knows how to push back on men with money. I know one. His name is Jim Peralta, in Charleston. He used to be a federal prosecutor. He handles cases like this now on a contingency. Meaning, Margie, you do not pay him anything unless and until there is something to pay him out of. He works on percentage. A percentage of what? A percentage of whatever is in the ground, if you decide to get it out. Margaret looked at him. Wendell, I don't think I want to get it out. Wendell blinked. That was the first time in the whole conversation he looked surprised. You don't. I don't want to mine on my land, Wendell. I grew up in a coal town. I watched my daddy cough for 30 years from what the mine did to his lungs. I watched what the companies did to this country. The hollows they ruined. The water they poisoned. The way they came in and took what was theirs to take and left nothing behind for anyone. She shook her head slowly. I don't want that on my land. I don't care how much they offer me. I don't want my father's ridge turned into a pit. Wendell looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do in all the years she had known him. He smiled. A full smile. The lines around his mouth and his eyes deepened, and his whole face changed, and she saw, for an instant, the young man her father had been friends with 60 years ago. Margie, he said, you are your father's daughter. I hope so. You are. You are exactly your father's daughter, and he would be a proud man if he could hear you say that. She looked down at her hands. She did not know what to say, but that does not mean you have to let the land sit there doing nothing, either. There are things in the ground, Margie, and there are ways of handling them that do not involve tearing up a mountain. You can sell the mineral rights without selling the land. You can put a conservation easement on the surface. You can do partial extraction with modern methods that do not destroy the watershed. There are ways. That is what a lawyer is for. That is what Jim Peralta does. He figures out the ways. Oh, you did not know that. No. Well, Margie, there is a lot you do not know. That is not a criticism. That is just a fact. You have not had occasion to know it, and now you are going to have occasion, and the good news is you have people who will help you learn. Me, my niece, Jim Peralta if you want him, and, I suspect, a few others who are going to show up before this is over. Margaret nodded slowly. She took a breath. She realized that her hands had stopped shaking at some point during the conversation, and that the knot in her stomach, the one she had been carrying since the moment Marcus's voice had come through the receiver 2 days earlier, had begun, slowly, to loosen. All right, Wendell, call your niece. Call Jim Peralta. I will. And Wendell. Yeah. Thank you. Don't thank me, Margie. Not yet. This is going to get worse before it gets better. He was right, of course. It did. Marcus called again that night. He did not leave a message. He hung up when the answering machine picked up, and then he called back 6 times in a row, each time hanging up. Margaret watched the light on the machine flash, and she did not touch it. She made herself a grilled cheese sandwich for dinner. She sat at the kitchen table to eat it. Eleanor May came over at 7:30 with a plate of cookies her grandmother had made, and they sat together on the living room couch and watched a television program about a man who rescued dogs from shelters in the southern United States and drove them in a van to adoption events up north. Eleanor May cried when one of the dogs, a 3-legged pit bull mix named Bruno, found his forever home with a woman in Vermont. Margaret put her arm around the child and thought about how it was possible for a person to be 9 years old and have more heart in her than a roomful of grown lawyers. At 9 o'clock, Eleanor May went home. Margaret turned off the television. She was about to go to bed when the phone rang again, and this time, for some reason she could not have named, She picked it up. Mother. It was Vanessa. Her voice was a careful voice. The voice of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation all day and who had decided, after much thought, that the correct tone was cold disappointment rather than anger. Vanessa, I want to talk to you, and I want you to listen, and I want you to hear me before you say anything back. Is that all right? Go ahead, honey. Marcus told me about your conversation. Tyler told me about his. I have listened to both of them, and I want to tell you now what I think. And I am going to be honest, Mother, because I think at this point in my life I am too old to pretend to feelings I do not have, and you are too old to be protected from things you have earned. All right, Vanessa. Vanessa paused. Margaret could hear her breathing. It was a controlled breath, the kind of breath a woman took when she was about to deliver a speech she had written down and rehearsed. I have spent my entire adult life, Mother, trying not to become you. I left Grayson Hollow when I was 18. I went to college and I worked 3 jobs to do it, because you could not help me. I went to graduate school and I paid for it myself. I moved to Dallas and I built a career and I married a good man and I had 2 children, and every single step of the way I was afraid. Afraid of what, you might ask? I will tell you. I was afraid of ending up like you. In a trailer on Route 9, alone, in a town nobody has ever heard of, with no money, no prospects, and no one to take care of me when I am old. Margaret sat down on the kitchen chair. And now, Mother, at the age of 67, when every one of your 3 children has finally made something of themselves, when we are finally in a position to simplify our lives and the lives of our family, you are choosing. You are choosing, for reasons nobody can understand, to hold on to a piece of scrubland that has given you nothing but grief and tax bills for 40 years, because of a promise you made to a dead man. A dead man, Mother. A dead man who cannot see what you are doing, cannot know what you are doing, and would not, if he could, want you to do it. Vanessa, I am not finished, Mother. I have one more thing to say. All right. Do you know how I felt the day I found out from Tyler that you had refused Derek's offer? I will tell you how I felt. I felt tired. I felt so tired I could not stand up straight, because it confirmed something I have suspected my whole life, which is that you have always loved the ghost of your father more than you have ever loved any of us. And I accepted that a long time ago, Mother. I accepted it. I built my life around it. But now, at the age of 43, I am tired of pretending it is not true. So I am going to tell you something, and then I am going to hang up, and then I am going to let you decide what you want to do with the rest of your life. Vanessa, if you do not sign the papers by Friday, Mother, I will not call you again. Not on your birthday. Not on Mother's Day. Not at Christmas. My children will not know you. If you choose a dead man over the 3 living people who came out of your body, then you will have what you chose, and you will have only that. Do you understand me? Margaret was quiet for a long time. Yes, honey. I understand you. I am sorry it had to be this way. I am too. Friday, Mother. Friday. Vanessa hung up. Margaret held the receiver in her hand for a moment, and then she put it back in its cradle, and she stood in the small kitchen of the small trailer, and she looked at the old coffee maker and the chipped mug and the blinking light on the answering machine, and she did something she had not done in a very long time. She cried. She cried standing up, with her hands pressed flat against the countertop, and she did not make any sound, because she had never been a woman who made sound when she cried. She just stood there while the tears ran down her face, and she thought about her daughter, and she thought about the particular cruelty of being told by a person you had carried inside your body for 9 months that the love you had given them had never been enough. When she was finished crying, she washed her face at the kitchen sink. She dried it on a dish towel. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her face was her mother's face, now. She had not noticed when that had happened, but it had happened, sometime in the last few years, and the woman looking back at her from the glass was the woman her mother had been at the end of her life. Lined, tired, but the eyes were still her own eyes, and they were clear, and they were not the eyes of a woman who was going to sign anything by Friday or by any other day. She went to bed. She slept, surprisingly, deeply. She dreamed of her father. In the dream they were walking up the ridge together, and she was a small girl, and her father was carrying a lantern, and he was showing her where the water came out of the rock. When she woke up in the morning, the dream was so vivid that for a moment she was not sure where she was, and she lay on her back in the narrow bed, and she listened to the silence of the winter morning, and she thought, very calmly, that she was ready now. She was ready to walk up the ridge. She did not know when the snow would allow it, and she did not care. She was ready. It took another 5 days. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Wendell came by with 2 pairs of snowshoes and a topographical map he had photocopied at the library, and he told her the forecast was calling for above freezing temperatures the next morning. They would go at first light. The next morning was the 2nd of January. The sun came up over the ridge at 7:32. Wendell arrived at 7 with his truck and a thermos of coffee and a small pack containing sandwiches and a flashlight and a first aid kit and a pair of walking sticks he had cut from dogwood branches at his own property. Margaret wore 2 pairs of wool socks and her father's old flannel shirt under her coat and a knitted cap her mother had made her in 1979. She carried nothing except the deed to the land, folded in the inside pocket of her coat, and her father's map, folded in the pocket beside it. They drove up the logging road as far as Wendell's truck could go, which was about a mile. Then they parked. They strapped on the snowshoes. They started walking. The snow was crusted on top and soft underneath. The walking sticks helped. Margaret's hip protested at the start, but after the first quarter mile the protest became a dull ache, and after the first half mile the dull ache became a kind of background noise she could ignore. The air was cold and thin and very clean. It smelled of pine and wet bark and the particular mineral smell that mountains have in winter, the smell of stone that has been cold for a long time. They did not speak much. Wendell walked in front, breaking a path. Margaret followed. The light came slantwise through the trees and made long blue shadows on the snow. A woodpecker was working somewhere up the slope, and the sound of it carried a long way in the cold, still air. It took them an hour and 40 minutes to reach the north face. Margaret had not been there in nearly 2 years. She had forgotten, a little, how it looked. The north face was not a cliff exactly. It was a steep slope that became, at the top, a rock wall about 30 feet high, and at the base of the rock wall there was a place where the ground opened up and the spring came out. Her father had shown her this place when she was 11. He had told her that the water that came out of this spring had been traveling through the rock for, probably, hundreds of years before it reached the surface. He had told her it was the best water in the county, and that if she put a cup under it and drank it she would taste the mountain. She had done that. He had been right. They stopped about 50 yards from the base of the rock wall. The spring was frozen, mostly. There was a small place at the bottom where the water was still coming through, and where a thin stream of it was trickling out from under the ice and running a few feet down the slope before freezing again. Above the spring, the rock wall rose up dark and sheer. Snow had drifted against it at the base, but there were bare places higher up where the wind had scoured the face clean, and Margaret could see the rock. She had never, in her life, looked at this rock with anything like the attention she looked at it now. It was dark, darker than the gray sandstone that made up most of the ridge, and there were, unmistakably, threads of something else running through it. Silvery lines. Not many. You had to know to look. But once you knew to look, you could see them, catching the low winter sun. Wendell. I see it, Margie. That's what's in the box. That's what my grandfather pried out. Yes. That's what Dr. Burke wrote about. Yes. They stood in the snow for a long time and looked at the rock. Neither of them moved. The woodpecker was still working somewhere up the slope, and the water was still trickling under the ice, and the sun was climbing. Wendell, Margaret said at last. I want to go closer. Careful, Margie. That slope ice is up. I'll be careful. She walked forward. Her snowshoes crunched through the crust. She reached the base of the rock wall, and she took off her glove, and she put her bare hand against the stone. It was cold. Of course it was cold. But there was something else, something she could not have put into words, a kind of hum in the rock, the way a bell can hum after it has been struck, hours later, when the sound has faded but the vibration is still there. She pressed her palm flat against it. She closed her eyes. Here begins everything, her grandfather had written. Hello, Granddaddy, Margaret said quietly. I'm here. Wendell, who was standing about 10 feet behind her, did not hear. Or if he heard, he did not say anything. She stood there with her palm on the rock for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she opened her eyes, and she put her glove back on, and she turned to Wendell. I want to see the cave. I figured you would. The cave was not a cave, really. It was a recess in the rock, about 15 feet deep and 6 feet high at the entrance, the kind of feature a geologist would call an overhang or a rock shelter rather than a cave. It was about 20 feet to the left of the spring. Her father had taken her here when she was a girl. He had shown her a place on the back wall where somebody, a long time ago, had scratched their initials into the stone. The initials were E.W. Her grandfather. He had carved them when he was 14 years old, according to her father, and he had scratched a date beside them. 1917. Margaret and Wendell walked to the mouth of the cave. The snow was deep at the entrance, and Wendell, using one of the walking sticks, pushed some of it aside so they could step in. Inside, the floor of the cave was dry. The overhang had sheltered it. There was a little scatter of dead leaves in the corners, and a bird's nest high up against the back wall, and the smell of old stone and old air. Margaret stepped inside. She looked toward the back wall. She could see, even in the dim light, the faint scratches where her grandfather had carved his initials. She walked to the back. She ran her gloved hand along the stone. The initials were still there. E.W. 1917. But there was something else, too. She leaned closer. She took her glove off again. Her fingertips found lines in the rock she had not noticed as a child. Thin, careful lines. They were low on the wall, near the floor. She knelt down. Her hip protested, but she ignored it. She ran her fingers along the lines, and then she pulled her flashlight out of her pocket, and she clicked it on, and she shone it at the wall. There was writing. Small, careful writing, chiseled or scratched into the stone. Not just initials. Words. A whole phrase. She leaned in. She read it aloud. For my children. For their children. For as long as the rock remembers. E.W. 1919. Wendell, who had come to stand behind her, breathed out slowly. Margie. I see it, Wendell. Your grandfather carved that. He did. The year he bought the land. Yes. She stayed on her knees for a minute. Her hand was still on the stone. The flashlight was still on, and the small circle of its light was shining on her grandfather's words, which had been there for over 100 years, and which she had never known about, because she had not come back here as a grown woman and looked carefully, because she had never had a reason to look carefully, because the land her father had told her to keep had just been land, until 2 days ago when her children had decided it was not worth keeping, and now here she was, kneeling on the floor of a cave on the mountain that bore her family's name, reading a message her grandfather had carved before her own father was born. For as long as the rock remembers. Wendell, I'm here. I want to sit down for a minute. You sit down. I'll put my jacket on the floor. He spread his heavy coat on the cave floor. Margaret sat on it. Wendell sat beside her, and for a while they did not speak, and they watched the small bright rectangle of the cave's mouth, and the blue winter light coming through it, and the way the sun, higher now, was catching the ice on the edge of the frozen spring and making it glitter like broken glass. Margie. Yeah. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it. All right. Your father was my best friend, and I think you already knew that, but you might not have known this. I made him a promise too, just like you did. The day he died, I sat with him in that rented hospital bed in your mother's kitchen, and he asked me to watch out for you. Not to take care of you, he said, because he said you were not the kind of woman that needed taking care of, but to watch out, and to be there if you ever needed somebody, and not to make a fuss about it, because you would not like a fuss. So that is what I have done, for 38 years. That is why I have come by twice a month with apples, or whatever else I had. That is why I kept the box in my closet. And I have never told you any of that, because your father did not want me to, and because I figured you did not need to know. Margaret looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She did not trust her voice. I am telling you now, Wendell said, because I think you need to know it now. Because I think what is about to happen to you is going to be harder than anything that has happened to you yet. And I want you to understand that you are not alone in it. You have never been alone in it. And you are not going to be alone in it, no matter what your children decide to do. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers. His hand was cold. She held it tight. They sat that way for a while on the floor of the cave, in the blue winter light, with her grandfather's words carved in the rock beside them, and the frozen spring trickling quietly outside, and Margaret thought, with a kind of clarity she did not often have, that perhaps this was what her father had meant when he had told her that what was in the ground did not matter as much as what you did with it. Perhaps the fortune had never been the rock at all. Perhaps the fortune had been everything around it. The man who had kept the box. The friend who had kept the promise. The daughter who had kept the land. Wendell. Yeah. Let's go home. I want to make a phone call. To who? To your niece. The librarian. I want to know who Derek Halvorsen is. and I want to know it before Friday." Wendell smiled. "Margie," he said, "that is the smartest thing you have said in 2 days." They walked back down the ridge together, slowly, carefully, and when they reached the truck, Margaret turned for one last look at the north face, and she saw it the way she had never seen it before, and she understood, finally, the full weight of what her grandfather and her father had given her, and the full weight of what her children had tried, without knowing, to take away. She did not say anything. She climbed into the passenger seat. Wendell drove her home. That afternoon she called his niece, whose name was Hannah, and who was, as Wendell had promised, very good with a computer. By the following Tuesday, Hannah Hayes had pulled together a 31-page document that included, among other things, Derek Halvorson's full business history, the names of the 3 shell companies through which he had acquired the 2 tracts of land on either side of Margaret's property over the preceding 19 months, a set of corporate filings from Nevada that connected Derek Halvorson, through 2 intermediate entities, to a mining and extraction concern called Halvorson Industries, LLC, headquartered in Billings, Montana, which had been founded by his father Axel Halvorson in 1974 and which specialized in, according to its own website, the identification and acquisition of undervalued resource-bearing land parcels in the central and southern Appalachian region. And she had pulled together one more thing. A single email, leaked from a public document archive related to a 2018 lawsuit against Halvorson Industries, in which Derek Halvorson had written to his father, "Dad, the Whitfield parcel is the last piece. Once we have it, the survey can go public and the entire ridge is effectively ours. The son is manageable. He's indicated the mother will sign if we make the offer look routine. Shouldn't take more than a few weeks." The email was dated October 14th, 2 months before Christmas, 2 months before Marcus had called her from the airport in Atlanta. Margaret read the email 3 times. She set the document down on the kitchen table. She looked at Wendell, who was sitting across from her. "The son is manageable," she said quietly. "Yeah," Wendell said. "The son is manageable, Wendell." "I know, Margie." She did not cry this time. She did not get angry. She did something, instead, that surprised even Wendell. She picked up the phone. She dialed her son Tyler's number. He picked up on the second ring. "Mom." "Tyler." "Honey, it's your mother." "Mom, hey, did you decide?" "Because Friday is..." "Tyler, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer me honestly. And if you answer me honestly, we are going to be all right. And if you do not, we are not. Do you understand?" There was a pause. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "How long have you known Derek Halvorson, Tyler?" The silence that followed was not a short silence. It was the kind of silence that has a weight to it, the kind of silence a person falls into when they have been asked a question they have been preparing, without knowing it, to be asked for a long time, and have never figured out how to answer. Mom, it's not what you think." "Tyler, how long?" "Mom, Tyler, how long?" He told her. The answer was 4 years. Margaret hung up the phone without saying goodbye. She sat at the kitchen table. Wendell did not ask. She did not need to tell him. He already knew. Outside the kitchen window, the January sun was setting, and the shadows of the pine trees were stretching long across the snow. And up on Whitfield Ridge, 40 acres of her father's land waited. The way they had waited for 105 years, for someone to come and take them, or for someone to come and save them, depending on whose story you were telling. Margaret folded her hands on the kitchen table. "Wendell," she said. "Yeah. Call Jim Peralta. It's Saturday, Margie. He won't be in his office. Then call him at home. Tell him it's an emergency. Tell him I want him on a plane to West Virginia by Monday morning. Tell him I have a situation, and I have money coming, and I am going to need everything he has." Wendell looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He picked up the phone. Jim Peralta landed at Yeager Airport in Charleston at 11:40 on Monday morning and was sitting at Margaret's kitchen table by 2 in the afternoon. He was a small man, compact, with thinning dark hair and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the tired, alert eyes of somebody who had spent a great many years listening carefully to people under stress. He did not look, Margaret thought, like a man who had been a federal prosecutor. He looked like a man who might have worked at the post office. But Wendell had told her not to go by appearances with Jim Peralta, and she trusted Wendell, and so she made him a pot of coffee, and she sat down across from him, and she told him the whole story, From the phone call on December 23rd to the email from Derek Halvorson that had called her youngest son manageable. Jim Peralta listened for 40 minutes without interrupting her once. When she was finished, he leaned back in his chair, and he took his glasses off the top of his head, and he set them on the table. Mrs. Whitfield, please call me Margaret. Margaret, I am going to tell you what I think, and then I am going to tell you what I can do. Is that all right? Yes. What I think is that you are in a stronger position than you probably realize. You have not signed anything. You have not taken any money. You have not, so far as I can tell from what you have told me, said anything on a recorded line that could be construed as agreement. That is very important. Men like Derek Halvorson, they build their cases on the assumption that the mark has already committed themselves in some small way, verbally or in writing, that can be leveraged later. You have not done that. You have held the line. The line is still yours to hold. All right. Second, the email Hannah Hayes found for you. That email is a gift. It is a documented admission, in the subject's own hand, that his purchase offer was made in bad faith, that he knew about the value of the deposit, that he knew you did not know about it, and that he was using your son as an agent of concealment. That is, in the terms of the law, fraud. Constructive fraud, at a minimum. And depending on what else Hannah can find, it may rise to the level of conspiracy. This is not a land dispute, Margaret. This is a criminal matter. And if we play it correctly, it is a criminal matter with civil penalties that could be very substantial. Margaret sat very still. My son, she said. Jim Peralta nodded slowly. Yes, your son. This is the hard part. I want you to hear me carefully on this. I am listening. Your son Tyler has, based on everything you have told me, participated in a scheme to defraud his own mother. He has done this for a payment or a promise of payment from Derek Halvorson. He has brought his siblings into the scheme, whether they knew the full extent of it or not. This is, legally, very serious. Depending on the details, he could be facing criminal charges. I am not the person who would bring those charges. But the United States Attorney's Office might be interested, and the Bar Association if he is a lawyer, and the state authorities in multiple states. He's not a lawyer. He works in tech. All right, so the bar is not an issue. But the rest stands. Now, here is the question I need you to think about very carefully and to answer me truthfully, because everything I do from here depends on the answer. Do you want to pursue charges against your son? Margaret looked down at her hands. She did not answer for a long time. Jim Peralta waited. He was, she noticed, good at waiting, almost as good as Wendell. Mr. Peralta. Jim. I do not want my son to go to prison, but I do not want him to get away with this either. And I do not want him to think that I am going to forgive him without consequence, because if he thinks that, he will do it again, and he will do it to somebody worse than me, and he will destroy his own life before he ever figures out he had one worth keeping. Jim Peralta allowed himself, for the first time since he had sat down, a very small smile. Margaret, he said, I see why Wendell speaks highly of you. What does that mean, practically? It means we have options. We can pursue Halvorson aggressively, because he is the actual criminal, and we let the consequences for your son flow from that pursuit without you having to push for them directly. Your son will face pressure. He will face legal fees. He may have to testify, under a grant of immunity perhaps, as a witness against Halvorson. That is a form of consequence, and it is a form that will teach him something, without you having to be the one to put him in a cell. Does that sound acceptable? Yes. Then that is what we will do. I am going to need your authorization to act on your behalf. I am going to draft a retainer agreement on contingency. I am going to file a notice of representation with Halvorson's attorneys. I am going to send a preservation letter to Halvorson Industries advising them that any destruction of relevant documents constitutes obstruction. And I am going to contact a geologist I know at the University of Kentucky who can give us an updated valuation on your parcel, independent of Dr. Burke's original report, so we know exactly what we are dealing with before we go any further. How long will all that take? A few weeks to get moving. A few months to get real answers. And, if this goes to litigation, a few years to see it all the way through. I will not lie to you about that. Cases like this are long. But you will not be paying me out of pocket. And the defendant, once we are properly engaged, will pay a great deal out of pocket. Men like Halvorson hate long cases. That is part of the leverage. Margaret nodded. Jim. Yes. There is something else I want to say, and I want to say it now, so that it is in the record, so to speak. Go ahead. I do not want a mine on that land. Jim Peralta raised his eyebrows. I beg your pardon. I do not want them to dig up the ridge. I do not want a pit. I do not want a company with a logo and a fleet of trucks tearing out the side of the mountain my father and my grandfather walked on. Whatever we do with this, I want the land to stay the way it is. I want the spring to keep running. I want my grandfather's initials to stay on that cave wall. I want the ridge to be there, the way it has been, for as long as I am alive and for as long as anybody in my family is alive after me. Jim Peralta looked at her for a long moment. Then he took a pen out of his shirt pocket and he began to write on the yellow pad in front of him. Mineral rights lease with no surface disturbance covenant, he said. Conservation easement over the surface acreage in perpetuity, held by a qualified land trust, probably the Appalachian Land Conservancy. I know people there. Royalty structure on the subsurface extraction using modern directional drilling from off-parcel access points. All of which, Margaret, yields you a significant income over time while keeping the land intact and adding, I might add, a very substantial tax deduction at the front end from the conservation easement itself. You can do that. I can do that. It is not the standard arrangement. But it is legal, and it is done, and I have, in fact, done it before. You are not the first person who has come to me wanting to keep a piece of land intact. You are, however, one of the few who understood what they wanted clearly enough to ask for it. Margaret felt, for the first time in many days, something like peace settle into her chest. All right then. All right then. He drafted the retainer agreement on the spot, in longhand on his yellow pad, and he read it aloud to her, and Margaret signed it with Wendell as the witness. Jim Peralta shook her hand. He shook Wendell's hand. He said he would be in touch within 48 hours with the next steps. He put on his coat and he went back out into the cold, and he drove away in the rental car he had picked up in Charleston, and Margaret watched his tail lights disappear down the road, and she turned to Wendell. Wendell. Yeah, I think I just did something serious. You did. I think I am going to need another cup of coffee. I think that is a fine idea. They sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. The afternoon sun was slanting through the window, and Margaret could see Eleanor May walking up the drive from the bus stop, her pink coat bright against the snow. Margaret watched her come. She thought about the child. She thought about what Eleanor May's life was likely to look like in 10 years, in 20, if nothing changed. She thought about her own children and the particular way in which money and distance had worked on them, and she thought about the line in her father's letter that had kept coming back to her over the past week. The money is not the thing. The thing is what you do with it. Wendell, she said. Yeah. When this is all over. Whenever that is. I want to do something. What kind of something? I don't know yet. But something for the children. Not my children. The children like Eleanor May. Children in the hollows who are not going to have anybody to leave them anything. Wendell smiled. Margie, he said. I was wondering when you were going to get to that. You were. I know you, Margie. She smiled back. Eleanor May reached the porch. Margaret got up to let her in, and the child came into the warm kitchen with her cheeks red from the cold, and she said, Miss Maggie, guess what? I got 100 on my spelling test, and Margaret said, Of course you did. Honey, come tell me about it. And for a little while, in the middle of everything else, the kitchen was just a kitchen on a winter afternoon, with a woman and a child and a quiet old man, and nothing in it that could not be understood without a lawyer. But later, after Eleanor May had gone home, the phone rang again. It was Marcus, and this time he was not calling from an airport. He was calling, he said, from the rental car he had just picked up at Yeager Airport, and he was, he said, about 4 hours out from her trailer, and he would be there by nightfall, and he and his mother were going to have a conversation, face to face, like adults, and they were going to settle this thing once and for all. Margaret listened to him. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she said, in a very calm voice, That is fine, Marcus. You come on. I will have supper ready. Supper. You have a long drive, honey. You will be hungry. Mom, are you listening to me? Do you understand what I am saying? I understand, Marcus. You are coming to try to bully your old mother into signing a piece of paper. I understand. Mom, drive safely, honey. The roads are icy in spots after the thaw. She hung up the phone. Wendell was watching her from across the table. She looked at him. Wendell. Yeah. My son is driving to my house to tell me how things are going to be. So it seems. I think I am going to let him tell me. Oh, and then I am going to tell him something back. Wendell laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but it was a real one, and it filled the little kitchen with a sound Margaret had not heard from him in a long time. "Margie Whitfield," he said, "I would pay money to be at that supper. You're invited, Wendell." "Oh no. No, ma'am. That is between you and your boy. I have known you both since he was in diapers, and I am not about to get in the middle of it. But I will be at my house, 3 miles down the road, with the phone in my hand, in case you need anything at all." "All right then. All right then." He got up. He put his coat on. He paused at the door. He turned back, and he looked at her, and he said, "Margie, you remember what Jim said. You do not have to say anything he can use against you. Halvorson's lawyers are going to want any recording of any conversation you have with your son. Be careful what you say. Be careful how you say it. Be kind, if you can, because he is still your boy. But be careful." "I will. I know you will." He left. She watched his truck pull away down the gravel drive. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time after he was gone. Then she went to the refrigerator. She took out a ham she had been saving. She peeled potatoes. She made biscuits from scratch, using her mother's recipe, the one her mother had taught her when she was 15 years old and had announced she was going to get married, because her mother had said no daughter of hers was going to go into a marriage without knowing how to make a proper biscuit. The kitchen filled with the smell of baking. It was the smell of every Sunday of Margaret's childhood, every holiday, every time she had ever welcomed her children home from anywhere. She set the table for two. Her mother's china, which she had not used in years, cloth napkins, a small vase with a sprig of holly in it that she cut from the bush beside the porch. She put the ham on a platter and the biscuits in a basket with a towel over them to keep them warm, and she stood in the middle of the kitchen and she looked at it all, and she thought about how many times in her life she had prepared a meal for her children, and how few times they had prepared one for her. The headlights came down the drive at 7:15. Margaret stood at the kitchen window and watched her son get out of the rental car. Marcus was tall. He had always been tall. He took after Charlie's side that way. He was wearing a black cashmere coat and leather gloves and the kind of shoes that were not made for gravel and snow. And he stood for a moment in the drive, looking at the trailer, and Margaret could see on his face the particular expression her son's face took on when he was preparing to be disappointed in something he had already made up his mind to be disappointed in. He came up the porch steps. Margaret opened the door. "Hello, Marcus." "Mom." He stepped inside. He took off his coat. He hung it carefully on the hook by the door. He looked around the kitchen. He saw the table set for two. He saw the ham and the biscuits and the small vase with the sprig of holly. He looked at his mother. And for a moment, just for a moment, something passed across his face that was not the face of a commercial real estate attorney from Atlanta. It was the face of a boy who had come home from school to find his mother had made his favorite dinner and had been, for reasons he did not understand at the time, touched almost to tears by it. Then the moment passed. The lawyer's face came back. "Mom, I don't need all this. We need to talk. We can talk while we eat, Marcus. I made your father's ham the way you used to like it." "Mom, sit down, son. Please." He hesitated. Then he sat. Margaret served him. She sat across from him. She said the small grace her mother had taught her, the one she had said at every meal for 60 years, and Marcus, out of habit, bowed his head. When she was finished, he picked up his fork. He began to eat. He tried not to show that he was enjoying it, but she could see that he was. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah, Mom. Before you tell me what you came here to tell me, I want to tell you something. Is that all right?" "Fine. I know about Derek Halvorson. I know who he is. I know what he does. I know what his company does. And I know that your brother Tyler has known him for 4 years." Marcus froze with the fork halfway to his mouth. "Mom, let me finish, honey. I am not going to yell. I am not going to cry. I just want you to hear me. I know that you did not know all of it. Tyler has told me he did not tell you or your sister everything, and I believe him, because I am his mother and I know when he is lying and when he is not. So I am not angry at you, Marcus, not about that. But I am going to ask you to hear what I am about to say, and I am going to ask you to think about it, and I am going to ask you to stop, for just one evening in your life, being the man you have trained yourself to be, and to be my son again." Marcus set his fork down. He looked at her. His face had gone very still. "Mom, what are you saying?" "I am saying, Marcus, that there is a man in Texas who has been planning to take this land from me for longer than you or your brother or your sister have been telling me it is worthless. I am saying that he used your brother to do it, and through your brother, He used you. I am saying that I have a lawyer now, and I am saying that I am not selling. Not to him, not to you, not to anybody. I am saying that the land is not worth $80. And I am saying, my son, that you are sitting at my kitchen table because you were sent here by people who thought an old woman in a trailer could be bullied. And I am saying that I love you, Marcus, and I always have, and I always will. But I am also saying that I am not going to be bullied. Not tonight. Not ever. Not by you. The silence in the kitchen was total. Outside, the wind had come up. A branch was scraping against the side of the trailer. Marcus stared at his mother. Mom, he said finally. His voice had changed. It was not the voice of the man who had called her from the airport 2 weeks ago. It was a younger voice. A quieter voice. Mom, what do you mean? The land is not worth $80. Margaret reached across the table. She took her son's hand in both of hers. Eat your supper first, honey. It will keep. When you're done, I have some papers I want to show you. And for the first time in many, many years, Marcus Whitfield looked at his mother the way a child looks at a parent who has just revealed, without warning, that they have been something other, and more, than what the child had always understood them to be. He picked up his fork. He began, slowly, to eat. Outside, the wind kept rising, and up on Whitfield Ridge, 40 acres of land that had waited for 105 years waited a little longer, and inside the trailer, a mother and her oldest son sat across from each other at a table set with her mother's china, and the evening turned into a longer evening than either of them had planned for. Marcus did not finish his supper. He ate about half of what she had put on his plate, and then he set his fork down, and he wiped his mouth on the cloth napkin, and he said, very quietly, Mom, show me the papers. Margaret got up from the table. She went to the dresser in the back room, and she took out the folder Hannah Hayes had put together, and she brought it back to the kitchen, and she set it down in front of her son. She did not sit back down. She stood behind his chair with one hand resting lightly on the back of it while he read. He read for almost an hour. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He turned the pages carefully, the way a man turns the pages of a medical report, and Margaret watched the back of his neck, and she watched the shoulders she had washed and dressed and fussed over a very long time ago. And she thought about how a grown son is, in some ways, still the boy he once was, still contained inside the larger shape of the man, and how a mother can always find him there if she looks in the right way. When Marcus got to the email, he stopped. He read it twice. Then he set the folder down, and he pushed his chair back from the table, and he stood up, and he walked to the kitchen window, and stood with his back to her, looking out into the dark. Mom, I'm here, honey. The sun is manageable. Yes. That's Tyler. Yes. Marcus put his hand against the window frame. His shoulders were shaking, very slightly. Margaret, who had known that back since the day her son was born, knew that he was not angry. He was crying. Quietly, the way she had taught him as a boy to cry, because they did not have a lot of money and tears did not solve things, and a man had to learn how to feel his feelings without letting them run him. Come here, honey. He did not move for a moment. Then he turned. He walked back to the table. He sat down in the chair across from her mother's empty place, and he put his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a long time. Margaret did not touch him. She knew her son. He did not want to be touched yet. Mom, he said finally, without lifting his head. How long have you known? About all of it. Since Friday. A week. A week. You've been sitting up here with this for a week, and you didn't call me. I didn't know, Marcus, if you were part of it. He lifted his head. His eyes were wet. He looked at her. He did not argue with her. He did not defend himself. He just looked at her, and there was a kind of grief in his face that Margaret had not seen since his father's funeral, when he had been 11 years old. I wasn't part of it, Mom. I know that now. I would not have done this to you. I know, Marcus. But I was going to drive up here and bully you into signing it. Yes. Because Tyler told me the land was worthless. Yes. And I didn't check. I didn't ask. I didn't think to. Because, Mom, because I thought I knew better. I thought I was being a good son. Clearing up your mess. Simplifying things for you. That's what I thought I was doing. He made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else. Mom, I am a commercial real estate attorney. Do you understand that? I know how to look up property assessments. I know how to check parcel histories. I have access to databases the average person cannot even find. And I did not look. Not one time. In 10 years of Tyler talking about his genius friend Derek and his clever little deals, I never once looked. Because it was you. And because I had decided a long time ago that what you had could not be worth looking at. Margaret did not say anything. She let him finish. Mom, I am so sorry. I know, honey. I am so sorry. I know, Marcus. She reached across the table then. She put her old lined hand over her son's hand. His hand was larger than hers. It always had been, even when he was 13 years old. He did not pull it away. They sat that way for a while. The kitchen was quiet. The wind outside had died down. The clock on the wall, the old electric clock with the cracked face that had been hanging in her kitchen since 1994, hummed its small, steady hum. Marcus. Yeah, Mom. I am going to tell you what I am going to do. And then I am going to ask you a question. And whatever you decide, I am going to love you. Do you understand? Yes, Mom. I am not selling the land. I am going to put a conservation easement on it, which means it stays the way it is, forever, no matter who owns it after me. I am going to lease the mineral rights, only, and only with what my lawyer calls a no-surface disturbance covenant, which means they can extract what is in the ground using modern drilling from off the property, and they cannot tear up the ridge, and they cannot ruin the spring, and they cannot change what my grandfather made when he put his initials on the wall of that cave. Do you follow me, honey? Yes, Mom. My lawyer tells me that the value of that lease, over 20 or 30 years, is going to be a great deal of money. He has not given me a final number, because he is still waiting on the new geology report. But it is, he says, going to be a very significant amount. Okay, now here is the question, Marcus. I am not going to leave it all to you three. Marcus looked at her. He did not flinch. He did not protest. He just waited. Tyler is not going to prison, because I do not want that. But he is also not going to be rewarded for what he did. He is going to get nothing, and I am going to tell him why, and I am going to tell him that if he ever wants to be in my will again, he is going to have to spend the rest of my life earning it back. Vanessa is going to get a portion, smaller than what she would have expected, because she is not as guilty as Tyler, but she said things to me on the telephone that a daughter should not say to her mother, and there needs to be a consequence for that, too. You, Marcus, are going to get a larger portion than the others, because you are the one who sat at this table tonight and wept, and because when you saw the truth, you saw it, and you did not argue with it. Marcus's eyes were wet again. He did not speak. But the largest portion, Marcus, is not going to any of my children. The largest portion is going to a foundation I am going to start. For the children in the hollows. The ones like Eleanor May from down the road, whose grandmother is dying, who has a voice like wind chimes, who will grow up with nothing if somebody does not do something. For the children whose parents are gone, or whose parents cannot. Because your grandfather did not leave me that land so that 3 grown rich people in Atlanta and Dallas and San Francisco could be a little bit richer. He left it to me so that I would know what to do with it when the time came. And the time has come. Marcus was still for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said, Yes, Mom. I understand. Good. Mom, I want to help. With the foundation. With the lawyers. With Tyler. With all of it. I want to be part of it. I want to be part of you again. If you will let me. Margaret looked at her son across the table. She looked at the face of the man he had become, and she looked, through that face, at the face of the boy he had been, and she saw that both of them were still there, and she understood that her job as a mother was not finished yet, and that it might never be finished, and that this was not a burden, but a mercy. Come over here, Marcus. He got up. He came around the table. She stood up, and she put her arms around her oldest son, and she held him, and he put his face in her shoulder the way he had not done since he was a small boy, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed in the little back room, where he had slept as a boy on the few nights he had stayed with her over the years, Margaret sat at the kitchen table by herself for a long time. She did not turn on the light. The kitchen was lit only by the glow from the wood stove. The ham was wrapped and put away. The dishes were washed and drying in the rack. She looked at the empty chair across from her, and she thought about all the empty chairs there had been in her life, and she thought about the ones that were no longer empty, and she thought about how strange it was that a woman could reach the age of 67 and discover, in the course of a single winter, that she had never really understood what her own life had been about until that particular moment. Around midnight, Marcus got up. He came into the kitchen in the t-shirt and the gym shorts he had traveled with. His hair was mussed. He looked, again, like a boy. He sat down across from her. Mom, you still up? I am. What are you thinking about? I was thinking about your father. Marcus nodded. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, I miss him. So do I, honey. Every day? Do you think he would be disappointed in me for how I have been? Margaret looked at her son. She thought about Charlie. She thought about the man Charlie had been, and the man Charlie would have been if he had been given the chance to grow older alongside his children. Charlie, who had been a gentle man and a flawed man, and who had loved his children fiercely and had, Margaret believed, understood them in ways she had never quite managed to. Marcus, she said, your father was a man who made a great many mistakes in a very short life. And one of the things he said to me, about a month before he died, when we were sitting up at night because Tyler would not sleep, was that the measure of a person was not how few mistakes they made. It was whether they let their mistakes become the story. He said, the thing that matters is what you do after. You do not get to undo the mistake. You get to decide what kind of person you are going to be in the afterwards of it. That is what he said. I never forgot it. I think he would tell you the same thing now. Marcus was quiet. Then he said, the afterwards of it. Yes. Mom. Yes. I think I am going to change some things. All right, son. I think I am going to start coming up here more. I would like that. I think I am going to call you on the phone. Not just on Christmas. That would be nice. I think I am going to bring the children. I would love to meet them. They sat together for a while longer. The stove ticked. Outside, somewhere, an owl was calling. Margaret thought that she had not heard an owl out her kitchen window in many years, or perhaps she had heard them all along and had only not listened, and she thought about how much of a life a person could miss simply by failing to listen. The rest happened quickly, the way these things do once the hardest part is over. Jim Peralta filed the notice of representation on Wednesday morning. By Friday, Derek Halvorson's lawyers in Dallas had sent a flurry of increasingly agitated letters. By the end of the month, an independent geologist from the University of Kentucky had walked the ridge with Margaret and Wendell and Marcus and had produced a preliminary report that placed the estimated net present value of the mineral deposit, extracted through the no-surface disturbance method Margaret had insisted upon, at a figure just shy of $41 million over a 30-year lease. Margaret read the figure. She read it twice. Then she set the report down on the kitchen table, and she looked at Wendell, who was sitting in his usual chair, and she said, Wendell. Yeah. $41 million. Yeah, Margie. For land my son told me was worth nothing. Yeah. $80, Wendell. I know, Margie. She laughed. It was not a happy laugh and not a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had been right about a thing for a very long time, and who was going to allow herself, just for a moment, to enjoy the fact. The email from Derek Halvorson, the one Hannah had found, did its work in the courts over the next 18 months. The lawsuit Jim Peralta filed on Margaret's behalf produced a settlement before it ever got to trial. Halvorson Industries paid Margaret an additional $4 million in damages for constructive fraud to avoid having the matter go public and open them up to investigations from the 3 other states where they had pulled similar schemes on other landowners. The United States Attorney's Office in Charleston opened a separate investigation that ran for 2 years and ultimately produced federal indictments against Derek Halvorson and his father Axel on multiple counts of conspiracy and wire fraud. Derek, as part of the deal his own lawyers negotiated, named a number of his intermediaries. One of those intermediaries was Tyler Fulton. Tyler was not charged. He was, however, required to testify under a grant of immunity. The firm where Tyler worked in San Francisco, upon learning of the testimony, terminated his employment. His wife, Jessica, filed for divorce 6 months later. Tyler moved back to West Virginia. He lived in a small apartment in Charleston. He worked at a technology job that paid him less than a third of what he had been making before. He wrote his mother a letter every month for 2 years before Margaret called him on the phone, and when she did not forgive him, exactly. She told him that forgiveness was a long road, and that they would walk it together if he kept walking. He kept walking. He still is. Vanessa did not call her mother after Friday, just as she had said, for 7 months. Then, in August, she called, and she cried on the phone for 20 minutes, and she said things that Margaret listened to without interrupting. And at the end of the phone call, Margaret said, Honey, you come home and see me when you're ready. I will make you a biscuit. Vanessa came in October. She brought her children. They stayed 4 days. The children, who had never seen Whitfield Ridge, wanted to walk up to the spring. Margaret and Wendell took them. It was a warm autumn day. The maples on the ridge were the color of a struck match. Vanessa's daughter, who was 8, touched the place on the cave wall where her great-great-grandfather had carved his initials in 1917, and she said, "Grandma, this is the coolest thing I have ever seen in my life." And Margaret said, "Yes, honey, it is." Marcus came up every month. He drove the 8 hours from Atlanta in a rental car, and he sat at his mother's kitchen table, and he helped her with the paperwork for the foundation, which was registered in the state of West Virginia in the spring under the name the Elias Whitfield Foundation for the Children of Appalachia. The foundation's mission was to provide scholarships, mentorship, and direct financial assistance to children in the coal country counties of West Virginia whose families could not afford the basic supports that children in the rest of the country took for granted. Books, dental care, musical instruments, bus fare, winter coats that fit. The foundation's first grant, in its first year, went to Eleanor May Brewster, age 10, of Grayson Hollow, for an all-expenses-paid summer at a music camp in North Carolina, where she would, according to the letter her grandmother read aloud at the kitchen table, receive private voice instruction from a teacher at the Eastman School of Music. Eleanor May cried. Her grandmother cried. Margaret did not cry, because she had cried enough for one lifetime, but she smiled. She smiled in a way that she had not smiled in a very long time. The Blackwater Stone lease, negotiated by Jim Peralta with a small responsible firm out of Pittsburgh that specialized in directional drilling, came online in the 3rd year. The first royalty check arrived in April of that year. It was for $1,200,000. Margaret held the check in her hand at her kitchen table. Wendell was across from her. Marcus was on the phone from Atlanta. Margaret looked at the check for a long time. "Well, Daddy," she said quietly, "here we are." She endorsed the check to the foundation. That first year, the foundation gave out 31 grants. The second year, 64. By the 5th year, the Elias Whitfield Foundation for the Children of Appalachia was supporting 212 children across 7 counties in West Virginia and 1 in eastern Kentucky, and had begun to draw modest matching grants from 2 larger foundations in Pittsburgh and Cleveland that had heard about the work through Jim Peralta's professional network. There was a small office now, 2 rooms above the hardware store in Grayson Hollow, staffed by a local woman named Beverly who had worked as a schoolteacher for 31 years and had retired and had been looking for something real to do with the rest of her life. Beverly answered the phone. Beverly processed the applications. Beverly, once a month, drove up to Margaret's trailer with a stack of files and sat at the kitchen table and read out, one by one, the names of the children the foundation had helped that month. Margaret listened to every one. She did not always remember them afterward, but she listened. She kept the trailer. She kept her old wool coat. She kept the chipped mug that had been her mother's. Jim Peralta, in his capacity as her personal attorney, made sure she had a comfortable annual income, enough to travel if she wanted to travel, enough to replace things that broke, enough that Eleanor May could come over any time she liked, and there would be cocoa on the stove. But Margaret did not move. She did not buy a house in town. She did not buy a newer car. She said, when Marcus asked her why, that she had lived in the trailer for 31 years and she was not going to leave it because of money, because money did not know where she lived and it did not get to decide for her. The trailer was still on Route 9. It still is. For years later, in the summer of what would have been her father's 122nd birthday, Margaret held a small ceremony on the ridge. She invited a few people. Wendell, of course. Hannah Hayes. Jim Peralta. Marcus and his wife Stephanie. Vanessa and her husband and their 2 children. Tyler, by himself, still thinner than he used to be, with a quietness to him that had not been there in his manageable days. Eleanor May, who was 14 now, and who was home from her 2nd summer at the music camp, and who sang, at Margaret's request, an old Appalachian hymn her grandmother had taught her, and who sang it so beautifully that Jim Peralta, the former federal prosecutor, had to take his glasses off and wipe his eyes on his sleeve. They gathered at the cave. The Appalachian Land Conservancy had placed a small plaque at the entrance, which Margaret had drafted herself. It read, "The Whitfield Ridge Preserve, protected in perpetuity by conservation easement. Elias Whitfield, 1903 to 1987. Amelia Whitfield, 1904 to 1991. Charles Whitfield, 1940 to 1983. For my children. For their children. For as long as the rock remembers. Margaret stood at the mouth of the cave. She did not give a speech. She had never been a speech-making woman. She said, instead, a few words that she had written down on an index card the night before, and that she read from the card because her eyes were not as good as they used to be. My father left me 40 acres, she said, and a promise. I kept the promise. It was the hardest thing I ever did, and it was the thing I am most glad of having done. This land is going to be here after I am gone. The spring is going to come out of the rock. The maples are going to turn in October. The children of Grayson Hollow and Logan and Mingo and McDowell counties are going to have warm coats and books and music lessons because of what is in this ground, and because of what my father told me not to sell. I want to thank him, wherever he is. I want to thank my grandfather, whose initials are behind me on this wall. I want to thank Wendell Hayes, who kept the cedar box in his closet for 38 years and never once asked me what was in it. I want to thank my son Marcus, who came back to me. I want to thank my daughter, who found her way home. I want to thank my youngest, Tyler, who is still on the road, but is walking it. And I want to thank Eleanor May Brewster, because a 9-year-old girl in a pink coat 2 sizes too big was the one who made me understand what any of this was for. She folded up the index card. She put it in her pocket. That's all I wanted to say. Wendell, beside her, put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She leaned her head against his hand for a moment. Then she stood up straight. She turned. She walked to the back of the cave, and she put her palm against the rock where her grandfather had carved his words, and she held it there, and she closed her eyes. Here begins everything, he had written. She could feel the hum in the rock again. The bell sound of stone that had been struck a long time ago and was still vibrating, quietly, just below the edge of what most people could hear. She stood there with her palm flat against it, and she thought about her grandfather, and her father, and Charlie, and her mother, and the child she had lost in 1962 who had been named Ruth, and all the people she had carried with her through a long life, and she thought, very simply, that she had done her part. The promise had been kept. The rock remembered. The land was safe. The children were coming. The work, such as it was going to continue, with or without her, because that was what she had built it to do. She opened her eyes. Outside the cave, the sun was high. The spring was running clean and cold, the way it had run for hundreds of years. Eleanor May was singing again, quietly, to Vanessa's younger daughter, a lullaby Margaret recognized from her own childhood. Wendell was standing at the mouth of the cave with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the valley. Marcus was standing a few feet behind him. Tyler was sitting on the ground, by himself, looking at the spring, and Margaret saw that he had his head bowed, and she knew, the way a mother knows, that he was praying, which was something Tyler had not done in 20 years. Margaret walked out of the cave. She joined Wendell at the mouth. She slipped her hand through his arm. Wendell. Yeah, Margie. Thank you. For 40 years. For all of it. Wendell did not answer for a moment. Then he said, Margie, your father used to tell me something. He used to tell me that the measure of a life is not what you get out of it, but what you manage to pass along. He said that to me more times than I can count. I did not always understand what he meant. I think I do now. I think I do too, Wendell. They stood together for a little while longer. The wind moved through the pines above the cave. Somewhere up the slope, a woodpecker was working. Margaret thought about the woodpecker her father had pointed out to her when she was a girl. She wondered if it was a descendant. She thought it probably was. She turned to her family. She lifted her hand. She said, All right, everyone. I think it's time to go home and have some supper. They walked back down the ridge together, slowly. All of them, the old and the young, the ones who had come back and the ones who were still coming. And the sun moved down behind the mountains the way it had always moved down behind them. And 40 acres of land that had waited 110 years for someone to understand what it was waited no longer, because the understanding had arrived, and the understanding, as it turned out, had been there all along, waiting quietly in a cedar box in a closet, and in an unopened letter in an old tin canister, and in the calluses on a dying man's hand as he pressed a deed into the palm of his daughter and told her, whispered to her, one word at a time, not to sell. Margaret Whitfield lived another 11 years. She died at the age of 78 in the small back bedroom of her trailer on Route 9, of natural causes, in her sleep, with Wendell Hayes sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding her hand. Her funeral was held at the small Methodist church in Grayson Hollow. The church was full. It was standing room only, in fact, which nobody had expected. Over 200 people came, most of them people Margaret had helped, directly or indirectly, through the foundation over the course of her last decade, and most of whom she had never met. Eleanor May Brewster, who was then 25 years old, and who was by that time a professional soprano studying for her master's degree at the Manhattan School of Music, sang, in the bleak midwinter, at her funeral, which was what Margaret had asked for in the letter she had left for Marcus, and she sang it as well as anyone in that church had ever heard anyone sing anything. Marcus Whitfield, who was then 55 years old, and who had, by that point, left his practice in Atlanta and moved permanently to Grayson Hollow to run the foundation his mother had founded, gave the eulogy. He spoke for about 7 minutes. Most of what he said was short. The last thing he said was this: "My mother was a poor woman for most of her life, and a rich woman at the end of it, and she was the same person on both days. She taught me that the land you protect becomes the person you are. She taught me that promises are things you keep, not things you make. She taught me that money is what you do with it, not what you have. I did not learn any of these lessons in law school. I learned them at a kitchen table on Route 9, from a woman in an old wool coat, who forgave me when I did not deserve it, and who loved me when I did not know how to love her back. I will miss her every day of my life. I will also, every day of my life, try to be the son she finally had. Thank you." He sat down. The church was very quiet. And then Eleanor May stood up, and she sang. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.